Keener, thank you so much for joining us on The Pastor and Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Yeah, thanks so much. I I haven't been in bars much lately. We don't have any in this town, so great to be with you.
Excellent.
Yeah,
We'll
we
pretend.
do normally ask our guests if they have a favorite beverage they want to tell us about, or if there's anything they're drinking at the moment that they want to feature. We always feature a drink on the show. So if there's anything you want to mention, feel free, but no
Well,
pressure.
I have some water with me.
There you go. There you go.
That's most interviewees.
Yeah,
that's the typical
That's
answer.
typical.
Yeah.
I actually haven't poured anything for myself yet. We got to remedy that.
Yeah.
So Craig, I should say I'm the one that wanted to have you on the show. I mean, Randy jumped on it too, but I was the one that saw that you had a book coming out, and I've benefited from your work for years. I don't remember when I discovered you, but I know I've been using your Bible backgrounds commentary on the New Testament for a long time. That's just been a go-to resource for me. Your 2-volume set on miracles has been on my to-read list since it came out, and I've just never gotten around to it because I had too much other stuff to do. And so when this came out and I saw, oh, there's a somewhat more manageable length version of that, I thought we gotta read this and have him on the show. So what we do on the show is we try to talk about topics that straddle both a pastoral perspective and a philosophical perspective. And so we've talked about lots of things that are relevant to philosophers of religion, but that also have a pastoral impact. And miracles was one of the things I thought we had to get around to talking about eventually. So thanks for writing a shorter version of this, I guess. It's still like 300 and some pages, but thanks, it's not 1,000. So that's a short work for you. We're talking to a guy, in case listeners don't know, who wrote a 4-volume commentary on Acts that's somewhere above 4,000 pages, I think. So this is a short book for him. So thanks for doing that. And I think we've both benefited from your work. You've used his commentaries in sermon series and whatnot. So
Yeah, I mean, any scholar who's a biblical scholar and charismatic, you get my attention right off the bat. There's not many of those, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We've got some questions for you in that, Craig. But
yeah, and hopefully it's okay. You've told us ahead of time that it is, but we're going to talk about miracles a lot. But I also want to talk about some more general New Testament stuff because it's just too good an opportunity to pass up to have you on the show. So thanks for being willing to talk about some other things too. So can you tell us a bit, to just get started, why you decided to document modern miracles, being a New Testament scholar? How did you get into that? And how is that, if you want to connect it up to your Pentecostal identity?
Yeah. Oh, that's 2 questions, but
It is 2 questions. Answer in whatever order you like.
yeah. The way I got started, and this was the earlier 1,100-page book, like 10 years ago. Well, it came out 10 years ago. It was because I was working on the Acts commentary, and there were a lot of scholars who just dismissed the historical plausibility of any accounts in the New Testament that included miracle claims. So I was like, okay, I'm dealing with the historical question here, but their argument was usually, well, these kind of reports can't come from eyewitnesses. And I'm like, that is clearly wrong, because I mean, I know lots of eyewitnesses who claimed it, and I've seen things that not on the level of some of the things in the New Testament, but on the level of some of the others. And so I said, well, let me just go and see if we do have eyewitness accounts of it. Well, not if we do, but let me compile some.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was working on that, the more that eventually I found more of what I was looking for. I found some volumes that had more medically documented cases and compiled a number of other accounts. But when I started, I hadn't. So it was originally a footnote in my Acts commentary. But after about 200 pages, I and my editors decided it was too long for a footnote.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be a longer book.
That would be like a record-breaking footnote, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. Just to give our listeners, Craig, just a taste of what some of these stories in the book, because there are some very remarkable stories in this book that you've kind of documented. You turned into kind of a journalist for this book, and just doing your research and talking to doctors, talking to family members, looking at backgrounds. Would you be willing to just tell our listeners 1 or 2 of the more dramatic stories or miracles that you documented in this book?
Sure. Now, part of the question is how we define documented. So
Mhm.
there are some where I actually have them from medical journals. Those are, I think, the strongest overall for persuading somebody who doesn't know the people. Um, some of the ones that were most persuasive to me were ones that I witnessed or experienced, or um, where it was somebody close to me. One that I like to talk about is my sister-in-law, because when she was about 2 years old, no, there was no medical help, so there was no medical documentation. So, when we say that as far as we know she wasn't breathing, at least that was um, the understanding of those who were present. So her mother strapped her to her back, ran to a nearby village where family friend Coco Gomo Moise was doing ministry. He prayed for her, and she started breathing again, and the next day she was fine. And when I asked her, um, I asked my mother-in-law about this, how long was it that she wasn't breathing? And she hadn't really, it seemed like, thought about that before. So she had to think to get from this village to that village. It was about 3 hours. And after 6 minutes with no oxygen, irreparable brain damage starts in. So that one got my attention because it was like so close.
Mhm.
And she, Therese has no brain damage. I mean, she has a master's degree. She just recently retired from ministry back in Congo. So that one got my attention. There were some others that got my attention. One time when um, we were planning an outreach on a campus, and one of the undergraduates, well, it was pouring down rain, and it was supposed to be pouring down rain all day. We hadn't known that, obviously, when we scheduled it. And actually, some of the leaders on the campus were just shutting down activities on the campus right then because of the downpour. And one of the it was actually a sophomore biology major from a nearby campus who was working with us, led us in a prayer for the rain to stop. I thought it can't hurt. She finished praying. Suddenly the rain stopped, and a few minutes later the sun came out and stayed out the rest of the day. Things like that are really meaningful to me personally. Obviously, I can't give you medical documentation for the rain stopping. Um, uh, there's probably some way to document it meteorologically. I was able to do that with somebody else's account, because where he was, I found there were F4 tornadoes in the area that day when they prayed, and suddenly the hailstorm that had shattered their truck window stopped. That was one of my doctoral students who shared that one. But in terms of the ones that are um, documented and published in peer-reviewed journals and so on, I mean, one of those would be the woman who was blind for 12 years, and it was organic, and she and her family, they didn't actually, it wasn't like they didn't believe miracles could happen, they just never had been familiar with any. But he was just so desperate, he just cried out to God, God, please open my wife's eyes. And suddenly she could see. And we have the before and after medical documentation, and that was published in a medical journal. And that was like several decades ago, and she's remained sighted. So those things are noteworthy, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the story of Barbara in the,
Mhm.
I think it was in the introduction, the second Barbara with MS. That one just
Yes,
floored me right off the bat. Can you tell a little bit about that one, Craig?
sure. Yeah, Barbara Comiskey Snyder, who, she recently did pass away from COVID, very sadly, but she was completely well for 40 years after the healing. She was sent home by the hospital. She'd spent most of the previous, well, half the 15 years in the hospital. She was sent home with a don't resuscitate order, because the family and the doctors had agreed there was nothing more that could be done. She her muscles didn't work. So she was hooked up to a machine so that her diaphragm could function. She had gone blind from multiple sclerosis as well. And she heard a voice saying, "My child, rise up and walk," which of course she couldn't do. I mean, she couldn't rise up to begin with. She, in her words, she was curled up like a pretzel. Her hands were so curled that they had to be uncurled every so often just to get the dead skin out. And then, but anyway, she jumped out of the bed. Somehow she landed flat on her feet, which was impossible because her feet normally were curled up. And the first thing she noticed was that her feet were flat on the ground. Second thing she noticed was that she was, her hands were not curled up. And third thing she noticed was she was seeing these things. And in most accounts of healings, the person, their muscles are still atrophied if they haven't walked for a long time. But in her case, I mean, it was so complete, even her muscles weren't atrophied. She was running around after she pulled out a lot of the plugs and stuff. And I consulted 2 of the 3 doctors who worked on her before this time. And all 3 of them actually have published something on it. And all of them agree that this was just beyond, I mean, not just beyond medical expectation, but this was something that just can't happen on its own. So, yeah, and she lived on 40 more years with no recurrence of multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, that one was like, okay, you got my attention now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense that you led off with that one, but like that's not necessarily the most dramatic story in the book. I mean, this book has a whole chapter, several chapters actually, on resuscitations, like people dying and then not being dead anymore. I noticed you didn't call that resurrection. I assume there's a theological reason for that.
Yeah, I didn't want people to confuse it with the, theologically, we often make a distinction with the eschatological resurrection, and Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits of that. Obviously, the people who are raised the way we're talking about in the book don't become immortal, they die again. So it's of a different character.
Yeah, but we are talking about like clinically dead for long enough for brain damage to have well set in, and then resuscitation with no lasting damage. So there's a lot of stuff like that in the book. Really crazy stuff. So in fact, most of the book is taken up with stories like that, and then there's some front matter and some end matter that are more theoretical and kind of framing. But if you're looking for a compendium of documented miracle cases, this is the book for you. So I'm coming to this as something of a skeptic. So just a little bit of background about me. I'm a philosopher. That kind of made me skeptical, but I was naturally skeptical anyway. It's kind of why I went into the field, I guess. But I'm also Pentecostal. And I had these Pentecostal, relatively typical Pentecostal experiences in college, got involved with this campus ministry that unbeknownst to me was filled with Pentecostals. And before I knew it, they were laying hands on me and I was praying in tongues and having this experience. And that lasted, that kind of spiritual high thing lasted for a few years, gradually dwindled, but I had enough like really powerful, tangible experiences of God's presence in those years that it shaped me in a way that I'll never be able to get out of, no matter how skeptical I am. I sometimes doubt past the point of belief and wonder, should I just call myself agnostic? And then I remember those experiences and I can't. And so I'm still solidly Pentecostal, happy to own the label, but I'm also a really weird one in that I'm extraordinarily skeptical of miracle claims. I've seen some stuff and been told some things by some very close friends who I know aren't lying that I don't have explanations for. But at the end of the day, I still come back to a kind of William Jamesian kind of place where I totally believe that is justificatory for your belief, you the person that experienced it. But at the same time, I don't think it is for mine from a sort of third person testimonial perspective. And reading, some of these crazy accounts in your book, that didn't change. so here, like, I believe you when you tell me that story, but I also don't go to the place of God performed a miracle there. I stopped just short of that. And so I guess what I want to ask you first is there's maybe a two-part question. So first, who's the sort of target audience of this book? And does it include people like me? So are you trying to convince skeptics like myself, or are you just trying to give sort of, hope and encouragement and faith building to people who already are inclined to believe in miracles? Am I included in the target audience?
Yes. Yeah, this one has a fairly wide target audience. Although I figure most of the people who buy the book will be people who already believe in miracles, because that's why they wanted to buy the book.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first book was really the more academic one. So this one is kind of for the people who it was on their to-read list, but they
Then they saw it.
yeah, exactly. So and so it's focused more on the accounts, and I focused more on the ones, like probably 70% of the material in this one was not in the first one. I didn't want to have too much overlap, so I didn't want to punish the people who already read the first one and feel like they're getting cheated when they bought the second one. But yeah, I think different people have different standards of evidence. You've got people who are like so gullible, they believe anything. And you have people who, like, I had a couple atheist friends who've told me that if somebody were raised from the dead in front of them, that wouldn't convince them. And I was an atheist before my conversion, but that would have certainly at least gotten my attention when, if something like that had happened. Or even if somebody had told me about it,
Mm-hmm.
it might have gotten my attention, but then I would really want to rigorously
Sure.
check into it to see how solid the claim was. So different people have different bars of evidence, and so I'm trying to give evidence that will be persuasive to those who can accept whatever kinds of evidence. Some of the ones earlier in the book weren't as, I thought, as strong, and some of the earlier accounts that some people have reported as raisings from the dead, when it was like they hadn't breathed for maybe 10 minutes or something. I'm figuring, well, if you're just off a few minutes, maybe. So I kept those in chapters about brain damage rather than sticking them toward the end about the resuscitations. But I'm hoping that there's enough evidence that it will be taken into account by a wide range of
Yeah.
readers.
So you do hope then for maybe some people who are skeptical to change their minds.
Yeah, to be skeptical sometimes of their skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, my training inclines me towards some skepticism, in the firsthand encounters and the reports of people closer to me, where I got to the place where actually, I guess I do believe these things can happen. In the first book, I was just going to deal with the question, do eyewitnesses claim these things?
Mm-hmm.
Because I could make a solid case. Obviously, eyewitnesses do claim these things. But then I got into some of the other questions because I decided it would be disingenuous for me not to come out and say, I do believe that these, or at least some of these, are special divine action.
Yeah. Let me put the question to you this way, and then I'll leave you alone about this. So I'm curious if you would say, having described to you my kind of skeptical outlook, where I land on specific miracle claims is agnosticism. I don't have any metaphysical objections to God doing that. I do have some epistemological objections to me believing reports of things that I didn't see or experience. And so where I land is kind of this agnosticism. Do you think that I'm lacking something important by being in this position that I should work on? And if so, is it spiritual? Is it related to Christianity? Is it just epistemic? Am I missing something important that I should try to change?
there is an epistemic question, but first let me say it's good that we have a range of perspectives on this, because we need some skepticism.
Hmm.
We need some people to keep us honest, because I mean, there are so many claims out there, and people can doctor videos and all sorts of things. So we want to be fairly rigorous, at least in looking into it. But at the same time, and I'm thinking, I guess, of Hume's epistemology, well, maybe not his epistemology in general. You know Hume as a philosopher, you know Hume way better than I do, so you could really address this better than I could. But in his essay on miracles, it just seems to me like the kind of epistemology where you have to witness it firsthand, that would completely shoot most of my work, or pretty much all of my work in ancient historiography. It would, well, yeah, ancient by definition, it would shoot all of it. I mean, journalism would become very difficult, law would become very difficult, anthropology and sociology would become very difficult. And then, you know, if you take it all the way, replicable things might not be impossible in terms of the argument that he used in the second part of his miracles essay. But until you replicate them yourself, it might not work. But it just seems to me like that's too constrictive an epistemology, and that we don't act that way for most things, except when it comes to miracle claims. That if we have a sufficient number of eyewitness accounts and so on, now then the question arises, is it special divine action, or is it just inexplicable? And there I think, you know, we're not talking about 100%, because it's pretty hard to, I mean, outside of like mathematics, it's pretty hard to affirm much like completely 100%. But it seems to me we have sufficient patterns that we can make a really strong case for. So believing it to a sufficiently high degree of probability that we can say, I believe this, even though we're not talking about mathematical certainty.
Yeah. I would love to argue with you about Hume, but we have so many questions on our outline that I'm gonna skip right over that one. What about, though, and then I'll hand it over to Randy. Do you think there's anything lacking in the Christian faith of a person who cannot bring themselves to believe in miracle reports? Let me tell you why I'm asking this. So I was in a church/campus ministry setting for several years, throughout most of my college and like first year grad school, in which it was Pentecostal, but it was the kind of prosperity, word faith kind of Pentecostalism. Very much off the deep end. Kenneth Copeland was their homeboy. I mean, it was, and they would say from the pulpit directly, if you're not getting healed, if you don't have enough money to pay your rent, if you can't afford the car you want, it's because you lack faith. And it's probably because you're sinning in some way. And then they would dig around to try to find what the sin is. And obviously that's a toxic cult. There was a lot of like weird leadership stuff going on too. Like you couldn't approach the leaders. They had this sort of aura around them that, you know, prevented any kind of questioning or skepticism.
Cheers, Kyle. You were part of a cult.
Yeah, no joke. Yeah. This was
Sounds like it.
Definitely cultish. And so there was a tone that was present in that setting. And sometimes it was just explicit, but even when it wasn't, it was implicit, that anything that you didn't get from God, that anything you couldn't bring yourself to believe, was somehow your fault. It was a lack of faith on your part. And I don't think you're saying that, but there are, if you forgive me for saying so, there are places in your book that reminded me of that. So for example, you say, I think it's in the preface somewhere. See if I can find it here. You know, you describe someone who, instead of saying that was a miracle that God did, will say that was inexplicable. It just happened. And that's me, like you're describing me. But then you say, to me, that seems a considerable stretch, but some prefer to take the leap of faith required by such an explanation rather than to trust a God who sometimes acts unexpectedly. And it's that kind of language, and that popped up a few times in the book, that reminded me in a I won't say it was like bringing back trauma, but it was like definitely reminding me strongly of some really unhealthy, toxic theology I had experienced. And I don't think you actually hold that theology. By all accounts of people that know you that I've talked to, you're a kind, sweet man. And so, like, I want to interpret you charitably, and so I want to give you an opportunity to explain what you mean, and if you think there is actually anything inferior about the theology of someone like me, who looks at the evidence and just simply can't bring myself to assent to it.
Yeah, I don't have the book memorized, but I think I recall that the context of that was talking about, well, I could be wrong, but I think the context of it was meant to talk about somebody who won't really accept any evidence for theism. It's not really talking about, certainly not talking about word of faith kind of theology, which I address later in the book, and talk about how, and also through the book, where, because in the first book I didn't deal with this at all, but I kept notes on it because I really was intrigued. I really wanted to know the element of faith in the people who prayed. And sometimes the people were like, I know God's going to heal me. But sometimes people say that and it's just denial. It doesn't happen. But then there were plenty of other people who, I mean, they prayed, but they were they were completely shocked with the answers to the prayers. So, and what I see in the New Testament is, especially right now, I'm working on a commentary on the Gospel of Mark, and it talks about these people that come to Jesus with great faith. But then you've got the disciples who are like the main characters after Jesus, and they are the antithesis of faith most of the way through. You know, Jesus stills a storm. It certainly wasn't the disciples' faith, guiding them afterwards. So it's not that our faith produces anything that sets people up to put their faith in their faith rather than their faith in God.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Do you have any sense? And then I really will turn it over to Randy.
I'm beginning to be skeptical. Speaking of skepticism,
Just because we mentioned word of faith people, which maybe we should define that. I don't know, for listeners who might not know. Do you have any sense of how common miracles are in that kind of theological context versus another, maybe say more mainstream Pentecostal or even non-Pentecostal context? Like, does all their psychological effort actually pay off at all?
Psychological effort. Well, yeah, obviously that would take care of the psychosomatic ones pretty well. But I don't know. I've kept notes, but again, these are more like case studies. Mm-hmm. Even though there are a lot of them. It's not like, you know, Pew Forum survey, I think it was 2006, just in Pentecostals and Charismatics in about 10 countries, they said that about 200 million of them claim to have witnessed divine healing. Now, of course, there are different levels of documentation. Well, actually, not even documentation in that case. Different levels of how freely we would call those divine healing. I mean, there's different levels of what we would think, but among anyway, I've only interviewed like hundreds of them, or not millions. But my sense is that we do have a number of them from Word of Faith circles, but that Word of Faith circles tend to report those a lot. Mm-hmm. And if they reported their cases where it didn't happen, it might be similar to what we have elsewhere. Yeah. I mean, the faith the clinging to God and the fact that they pray, I mean, it's probably more likely to happen there than people who don't pray. At the same time, you probably also have more people who die refusing or neglecting medical attention. Although I think most Word of Faith circles don't say that it's wrong to use medicine. But yeah, I can't answer that definitively. I'm just basing it on my sample size.
Sure. Yeah, fair enough. So, Craig,
but I should mention, because I forgot to answer the one about my Pentecostal identity earlier.
Oh, right.
I'm actually ordained as a Baptist.
Oh, no way.
So yeah, but I'm experientially Pentecostal. So I answer to that. And anyway, so but go ahead.
Why'd you have to tell us you're ordained Baptist, Craig? So, Craig, I am a pastor, been pastoring for 15 years. And that means I've prayed for countless people. I mean, just person after person, Sunday after Sunday, day after day of people coming to me asking for prayer, whether it's by text, phone, in person, prayed for the same person, people for years who are dealing with chronic illness or chronic pain. And I have heard reports of people coming back and saying, praise God, I got healed, and in response to that, I think when I was younger, I probably felt really awesome about myself, that my prayer was effective, the prayers of a righteous man. And then I've just seen so many what people would call in layman's terms unanswered prayers, or you don't get the healing, or the sickness takes over, or even death happens. And I've seen that so much more often than, quote unquote, answered prayers. So while I do believe in miracles and the supernatural work of God in the world and in among human beings, I also believe, because of my experience, they don't happen way more than they do happen. And that's pastorally now. So I'm asking you kind of a pastoral and maybe a little theological question, but you do say your book's primary goal is not to document miracle reports and not to deal with theological questions surrounding miracles, but I'm sorry, I've got one for you. We have to recognize that the fact is that most requests for miracles are unsuccessful, and that the norm for everyone, regardless of religious persuasion, is that illness, injury, suffering, you name it, take their natural course unless medical intervention is available. And you acknowledge this by calling miracles a special divine action even. And you talk a bit about why they're not more common at the end of the book. But if this is the case, how do we hold to the supernatural movement of God while we also see more typical silence from God? How do we, I'm asked this question, I want to say all the time, of what do I think about prayer? What do you think about prayer when a lot of our prayers seem to go unanswered, or we don't get what we pray for? How do we hold prayer? How do we hold intercessional and healing prayer in light of this? And how do we hold this God who seems to move sometimes in miraculous ways, but more often than not doesn't?
Yeah, and I think what we see is pretty similar to what we see in the Bible as well. I mean, in Genesis, you've got all these genealogies. So-and-so begot so-and-so, and they died. And then so-and-so begot so-and-so, and then they died. Death and sickness, the reality of those are taken for granted in the Bible. So even when you have a case of somebody where miracles were surrounding the person, like Elisha in, is it 1 Kings 13, 2 Kings 13, where he is sick of the sickness with which he died. And it doesn't even give an explanation. It just says that was his condition. He's prophesying at that point. And then later they throw a corpse in on top of his bones, and the corpse revives. But Elisha died of a sickness. Paul says, Trophimus I left at Miletus sick in 2 Timothy 4. Epaphroditus was sick close to the point of death in Philippians 2. Paul himself was afflicted with bodily weakness in Galatians 4:13. So it's like it's not like they even try to give explanation. It's just like this is part of the norm of the world. But then in the Gospels and Acts, we also see so much healing and so many other kinds of dramatic incidents taking place. But I think that's why theologians often call that special divine action. Like God has blessed us with life to begin with. He's blessed us with so many things in the world. That's general divine action. But special divine action is meant to get our attention in a special way. And the kind of setting that we have in the Gospels and Acts is that of groundbreaking evangelism as the message of the kingdom is going forth, especially in new areas. So it doesn't exclude things happening elsewhere. Paul also talks about gifts of healings. James talks about praying the prayer of faith, the elders doing that for the sick, and so on. But those don't have to be dramatic. I mean, if it happens through just the way God created our bodies to repair themselves until the ends of our telomeres start wearing out, then I mean, we can still give God thanks for it. If it's through medicine, we can give God thanks for that. But those are the more dramatic ones. I think happen especially in the context of groundbreaking evangelism. And that's I have seen that pattern in terms of the places that I've explored and interviewed.
Yep. Yeah. And I don't think that's an uncommon experience or interpretation. Yeah. Another pastoral question, because that's again me. I've seen people walk away from the faith, walk away from Christianity because they grew up or were in a fairly charismatic environment where people would talk about hearing from God in prophetic ways, or people would pray in tongues and do that easily and fluently. You name it. They had these experiential moments with God on a fairly regular basis, or said they did. And then the people who didn't felt like, well, where's my, like, why are you, if God's doing that, why is he holding out on me? I'm sure as I'm saying this, tons of listeners are identifying with this. And I've seen it go to the extent where people walk away from God because they say, well, I'm waiting for God to show up in a dramatic way, in an experiential, supernatural way. And until he does, I'm done. And as a pastor, I don't like that at all, because I don't want to build people's faith off of what God does for me, or what the supernatural, miraculous things that God can deliver for me. I want to build people's faith and discipleship journey on the beautiful way of Jesus. And that being the foundation, and that alone being the foundation. And then if we see miraculous things or supernatural things or charismatic experiences, praise God, but let's not hang our hat on them, because I myself have had seasons in my life where I've experienced, quote unquote, the presence of God or the supernatural more than for the last several years. And I think my faith is a little bit more grounded and mature now than it was then. So how do you write a book like this, which thank you for writing it, but how do you ground this in that, and not set people up to say, well, if that doesn't happen to me or my family, I'm out?
Yeah. Paul talks about, and this is in the first generation of Christians. Actually, when he writes to the Corinthians, most of them wouldn't have been Christians for more than 2 years at the time that he writes to them. And he emphasizes that there's one body with different gifts. And so we shouldn't be exalting one gift above another. In Corinth, part of it was gifts of speech, because that was really emphasized in their culture, and knowledge. He talks about in 8:1, 1 Corinthians 8:1, that people sometimes are arrogant about their knowledge, and then they were really, really emphatic about tongues. And so he deals with that in 1 Corinthians 14. My wife doesn't pray in tongues, although she'd like to. In my own case, it happened to me 2 days after my conversion from atheism. I had no idea what it was. So it wasn't even something I sought. It just happened to me. It's important to let people know that we're all wired differently, and that's all right. God God has gifted different ones of us in different ways. And so I think you have some kinds of churches that look down on others because they're not, they don't know enough. And then some of those other churches are looking down on these churches because they aren't spiritual enough, and by their definition. And in both cases, I think it's arrogance when we need to humble ourselves and learn from one another and work for the unity of the body of Christ. And so those of us who have more information, we need to work to help those who are. Something that bothers me a lot is that sometimes you have some people who are really emphatic on the teaching gift, who are like so anti-charismatic that, of course, charismatics are not going to feel welcome to listen to them. And then you have some people who are so into like the cultic type stuff that was just described, that, and I know people who walked away from the faith too because of their expectations. This needs to be happening to me. If it doesn't, why should I believe that it happened to anybody? Or some people are putting it forth like it should happen to everybody the same way because it happened to them that way. And they're impervious to correction because they think they're so spiritual. If we could get people to stop reacting against each other and to listen to one another and talk with each other, I think we'd have a much healthier body of Christ, instead of amputating certain members from one side and then piling up the amputated members on the other.
Yep. Yeah. That's really good. And speaking of information, I just want to color our listeners' idea of this conversation as we're looking at you, Craig. We mentioned this earlier, but we weren't recording, but we are looking at this incredible background that looks like it's fake because there is just a
this is worth going to YouTube and looking.
Yeah, it's a long tunnel of filing cabinets with just uncountable books piled on top. And it looks like,
it's not fake. It's real.
It's not a facade.
It is unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. And
they're all full.
Oh yeah. So I mean, if you want to have a fun week, just go to Craig Keener's basement office and just dive into all the information.
Don't actually show up at his door.
Don't do it. Yeah. Thanks for that answer, though, Craig.
So one quick follow up to that. I'm curious, what is your experience like? I mean, I think it's safe to say, I don't think I'm overstating anything here, that you are probably the foremost Pentecostal biblical scholar, just period. And you run in some circles that
I mean, Gordon Fee is way up there as well.
Fee was one of your mentors, wasn't
Gordon Fee would be further ahead. And actually, I mean, charismatic biblical scholars include people like Ben Witherington, N.T. Wright, and so.
And I'm taking all of them into account, so I know what I'm saying.
We're telling you you're awesome, Craig.
So, I mean, just given your output and your standing in the community, but you run in circles, you must, with colleagues who are not Pentecostal and who probably don't believe in miracles. Many of them probably aren't even theists. And so I'm curious, given that theme of, coming to the table and talking to each other and just having an honest conversation, what's that like for colleagues who don't see things the way that you do? Are you able to... I don't know. Do you have good relationships? Do they look askance at your work, or what are your relationships there like?
It depends. No, mostly I think it's good relationships. So, I mean, you've got plenty of common ground on just the fact of being biblical scholars, in terms of working from a historiographic standpoint. Although I've had some people who don't like using historical background. They're kind of against it. And so, but we still have common ground in terms of literary approaches. So, I mean, I try to look for the common ground and we work from there. We have so much to work together on. But there there are times where I feel like I've experienced prejudices. I mean, there was one time where my first book on historical Jesus research, I thought I was working from fairly minimal epistemological assumptions. Well, in that case, I was working from some accepted criteria across the board in historical Jesus research, which are not all accepted today, but they were accepted when the book was written. And so, but then there was this one session at the Society for Biblical Literature, where somebody who was responding to the book started his response by saying, "Oh, there's two kinds of scholars. There are genuine critical scholars, and then there are evangelicals. And you evangelicals should not be allowed in the room with us." Like, really? So, I mean, I wasn't trying to write an evangelical book. I was trying to, I mean, I am an evangelical, but I was trying to write a book that was just good scholarship based on historical approaches that I thought were widely used. And since then, I've worked a lot more on ancient historiography, trying to put things in their original context. But I mean, that's kind of an outlier. For the most part, whether SBL or anywhere else, we have fairly respectful dialogues, and when people disagree, we can still listen to each other and learn from each other, and we may not agree on one thing, but also in a lot of those settings, we come together based on the common ground, on shared epistemological assumptions, so that there's some things that are fairly off the table unless somebody brings them up, and then I figure it's fair.
The gloves are off.
But even then, usually in those contexts, it's fairly respectful. So
I've got one question, and then we'll let you go. If that's okay. I want you to settle a bet between, or a disagreement between Randy and myself. So this came up on a previous episode, and it's also kind of been making the rounds on like progressive Christian Twitter, which I don't know if you know that that's a thing, but it is. I don't know if you're on Twitter, but sometimes things happen, and everybody in that section of Twitter gets really excited for a few days. And recently, one of the things that happened was a kind of well-known pastor posed the question, and this is an ancient question, but a lot of people on Twitter seem to be thinking about it for the first time. And the question was, what about your faith, practice, belief, whatever, would change if, per impossible, we had definitive proof that Jesus' resurrection did not happen? So let's say, we invented some kind of time machine or whatever sci-fi scenario you have to imagine to definitively prove this. I watched a show called Devs one time where they built this quantum computer that was able to basically give you a kind of video feed of any point in history, and they were able to go back and watch Jesus on the cross. So let's imagine we have some kind of like seriously definitive, objective proof that Jesus was not in fact resurrected. What about your faith practice? What about your belief? What about your view of Christianity in general would change? Randy is on the record taking the view that some personal subjective stuff would change. I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but in general, not that much would change. You would continue to practice. You would continue to find similar meaningfulness in Christianity. For me, it would completely change. I would find no reason to be a Christian and have no hope anymore. So I guess two parts to that question. What's your answer to the question personally? But also, what do you think Paul's view of it was? When he said, if the resurrection was false, we're hopeless, or we're to be pitied, or however he put it. Do you think he was being hyperbolic? Do you think he meant that concretely? How do you approach that?
Yeah. Answering the last thing first, yeah, I think Paul really meant that. Although he was a theist before, he still had hope in terms of Israel, but it would have messed up everything for his Gentile converts. That was the basis of their faith. And of course, I came to the faith through the message about Jesus. But since we're entertaining counterfactuals here, because I really think all the evidence we have points in the direction that Jesus did rise from the dead, unless you assume that that's impossible. But let's say we did have a time machine and we could have stronger evidence and it like undercut all the evidence we had. If I thought Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that would definitely change my faith. I could still be a theist, which is nice that through Christian faith, I came into theism from atheism. I could still be a theist, but I couldn't be a Christian in a meaningful sense. I could say, okay, I like some of Jesus' teachings. I like some teachings. Well, I like a lot of Confucius's teachings, actually, and like some other teachings, some of Buddha's teachings. But I like some things in a lot of other religious and philosophic documents, like Seneca and Epictetus a lot. But he wouldn't be Lord, obviously. Now, I'm wondering if what you're saying is physical resurrection, as opposed to something else. Okay.
Yeah. So why wouldn't he be Lord, though? So this was Marcus Borg's view, right? That there is a real sense in which he's still Lord. There's a real sense in which Christianity is still true. And I can practice all the same ways and I can have all the same meaningful experiences. I think he literally said, like, what does believing in the physical, material, bodily resurrection add to that I don't already have?
But part of the question, I'm not sure if this is where he was coming from. I've read some of his stuff. I did correspond with him some while he was alive, but part of it may be he may have defined physical and material in a different way so that he may, but if it's just like a ghost, just like an afterlife. I had a professor where we dialogued about this, and that's basically what he believed. He said, well, I think the corpse of Jesus probably rotted in the tomb, and that he still had an afterlife, but just like I hope to have an afterlife. In that case, there's nothing really distinctive about Jesus. And so I would not see that as, I wouldn't see Jesus as Lord, and I wouldn't see a basis for the Christian faith as being distinctive in any way. Well, I mean, there's still some good ideas. Mission to the Gentiles, bringing them to faith in the one true God, and the experience of the power of the Spirit. But I mean, it was all rounded in believing that Jesus was the risen and exalted Lord. So, what kind of resurrection body we're talking about may be disputable, but if you're just talking about a ghost and the corpse was left behind, then I think Paul would say, we're of all people most miserable. We're just fighting wild beasts in the arena in Ephesus for nothing.
Yeah. So just to state my position.
Yeah, I tried my best to remember what you said, but I may not have gotten it right.
I do believe in the resurrection, for one. I'm, writing my 15th sermon on the resurrection as we speak, and I think the resurrection matters not just a little bit, but it matters for everything at all times. I think, I could talk for a long time about why I think the resurrection matters intensely. However, my faith doesn't rest solely on the resurrection, and my faith in Jesus and Jesus' work doesn't rest solely on the resurrection. I think the incarnation we've sold short in many ways. I think the incarnation of Christ, because that's not part of the question of whether or not the incarnation and the resurrection happen. It's just the resurrection. So I think the incarnation in and of itself is enough for me to follow Jesus and say that this is a unbelievably beautiful, revolutionary story of the infinite God becoming a finite person and become, all that goes into incarnation is enough to keep me around easily. And then you add to all of the life and ministry and teachings of Jesus. And I haven't read hardly any of the guys that you mentioned, Craig, but I have read Jesus a lot, and the Jesus way honestly keeps me in the Christian camp easily as much as the resurrection, because this Jesus way for me is kind of the answer to the world's problems. The way of agape love, loving your enemies over your, loving your neighbor over yourself. And I mean, a new commandment I give to you, love one another. I mean, I could just go on and on about the teachings and ministry of Jesus and say that's enough for me. Like, I would, even if Jesus is dead in somewhere in Jerusalem somewhere, or off Jerusalem, I'm still in. That's my position. Even though I definitely believe in the resurrection, it's not the end all be all for me. I don't agree with Paul. That's where I would disagree with 1 Corinthians 15 and say, I think Paul was probably being he was speaking in hyperbole a little bit. Maybe he's trying to prove a point, but I don't think it's just like we toss the rest of it to the rubbish if the resurrection didn't happen. That's my position.
You're actually not disagreeing with him if you're saying it's hyperbole. You're just interpreting him differently. But
exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, Jesus' teachings are beautiful, but I had to grapple with this when years ago I had friends who were in a place where jihadists were killing them. I mean, my friends didn't get killed, but a lot of their friends got killed. And I struggled with this, thinking, okay, turning the other cheek is the right thing to do, but is it the right thing to do in a setting like that? Can we let people defend themselves? Should we intervene to defend them? And I guess that's a different question on a corporate level than just on an individual level, because I have been beaten and had my life threatened actually for my witness before, and I did turn the other cheek. But I was like, is this practical?
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly practical if we believe in the hope of the resurrection. But if I didn't believe that Jesus rose, I think I wouldn't believe in the incarnation either. I might appreciate some of Jesus' teachings, but the idea of the incarnation, of a God who loved us to the extent that he would actually become one of us and share in our pain, die on the cross, but then just leave it there, how would he still be God? And so it might be a nice enchanted story, but I think I wouldn't really believe much of it.
I think that's a nice place to leave it, considering we're Holy Week and Easter is upon us, and Craig just agreed with me. So I think we could probably finish it right
Even
here.
though we're going to drop this episode some random time.
Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Craig Keener, thank you so much for just giving us your time and exposing us to the cavern of academia that you have behind you that just is still blowing me away. We're really appreciative for your work that you've done over the scriptures over the course of decades, and really thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me. And again, I'm just a sample. There are scholars who hold a wide range of different views, but these are the things I'm thinking.
That's the best kind of scholar right there.
Right.
A humble one. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.